I'm Georgie Frost. Today we're talking about the journey to net zero with Ben Murray, CEO at Avieco, a leading sustainability consultancy based in London. Since 2007, Avieco has been working with global corporations, government departments and international institutions, as well as local councils and individual communities, to create a sustainable, low-carbon economy and society. A very warm welcome, Ben. Before we get started into the details about the journey to net zero, just tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at Avieco.
Great, thanks, Bob. A real pleasure to meet you, Georgie. We set up in 2007. It was a real sort of important personal moment for me. My second daughter was just about to arrive, and as any parent knows, you start to think long and hard about the future that you're creating for your kids. And at that time, we'd started the global debate on carbon footprints, on reducing those, but it was still a long way from being a widespread issue. It was a long way from being something that people knew how to act upon. And in the middle of that mix, we started the business. At the time, we were called Carbon Smart, and Carbon Smart that idea has stayed with us. We don't think you can be carbon neutral. You can't be neutral about carbon, which was a common term at the time. You need to be smart about this. We need to reduce our emissions. We need to get clever about the innovation, the technology, and so on. But our work essentially is partnering with businesses that are on a journey to become a more sustainable business. It is my view that at some point in the future, every business must be sustainable. We don't have a future as an economy or a society with a linear economy, and that means that every business needs to look long and hard at the resources it uses, the proposition it makes, and we're in the business of helping those organisations on that journey.
Ben, we hear a lot about net zero, but what exactly is it? Just explain to us, if you would, and what are the drivers for it?
Sure. So net zero, it's another label that is helping us all to communicate the challenge that we're taking on. The way I like to think about climate change and global warming is in terms of a budget, really. As we cause greenhouse gases to be emitted through industrial and commercial and personal activity, we're pushing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they stay for an awful long time. In the case of carbon dioxide, which is the most common, 100 years or more. And their presence in the atmosphere causes global warming. And so when we look through the lens of climate science, what we've established is there's a limit to how much greenhouse gases we can push into the atmosphere before we cause catastrophic warming. And so there's a limit on, in a sense, the total emissions that we can cause, our budget, if we're going to avoid the worst of global warming. As we stand today in 2021, then the budget left is something like 500 gigatons, which sounds like an awful lot, but we're a global economy pumping a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So what net zero says is, well, if that budget's finite, if there's a limit to the total emissions that we can pump into the atmosphere, then we've got to do two things. Either we stop emitting emissions at some point, or we reduce those emissions that we're causing to a point where we can compensate for them. And net zero is the straightforward concept that as an organisation, a person, an activity that is net zero, you no longer contribute to us using up that budget. So if you are still causing emissions, then you are also undertaking activities to remove emissions from the atmosphere, and so netting them out at a zero contribution. It's really important because in the end, we have got to get to a point where the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are stable, that they're below the level that causes catastrophic global warming. And so in the end, we've all got to be net zero. We can no longer carry on causing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to increase. There's a finite budget to all of that.
Is net zero enough?
Well, that's a really good question. I suspect that it's not going to be for those people that sign up to it, because that budget, the 500 gigatons, is still being used up. And some of the biggest polluters out there, some of the countries that are causing very significant emissions, are yet to commit to reductions that are going to get us to the levels of emissions that we can sustain in time. And that means that they will be using up that budget quicker than the rest of us. And so some of us are going to have to do more than just net zero. We're going to have to start to take more emissions out of the atmosphere than we're causing.
Well, I was going to ask you about the net zero and what it means for different sectors, because there are going to be some sectors that need to urgently address net zero more than others. But the reality is there are some sectors that quite simply won't be able to reach net zero. Will the burden fall more heavily on other areas that can?
Again, a good question. I think we currently have technology and innovation in many sectors that will allow us to get to net zero, but we have some sectors where that innovation has yet to occur. And so you're right, there is a current view that there are certain sectors, and we might take aviation as one, where it currently is not possible to fly aircraft without causing greenhouse gas emissions. That may change. Research on electric aircraft, on alternatives to fossil fuels is underway. I suspect that in the end, every sector will get there. It's just going to take far longer for some than others. But time is running out. So we don't have the time to wait for every sector to get it right. And wherever the emissions come from, they cause a global problem. So you're right. In the end, the global economy needs to be net zero, even if within it, some of the sectors are not. And so clearly that means some sectors are going to move faster and harder than others.
In a more general sense, though, what does the net zero journey look like?
So we're talking about a journey with two halves, really. So if we are to keep ourselves within that budget, then we've got to, in the first case, radically reduce the emissions that we're causing. And by radically, we are talking about somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% of the emissions that we cause at the moment need to stop. So when we get to 2050, we need to be causing only 10 or 20% of the emissions that we're causing today. So that's the first half of the net zero journey, looking at all of the activities that a business or an organisation undertakes and identifying and putting in place measures to reduce that. But there will be emissions, as you've already pointed out, that we can't get rid of, the emissions that we will continue to cause. And so the second half of the net zero journey is removing equivalent emissions from the atmosphere to net those out. And that's done by carbon offsets of a particular type, ones that do remove emissions that are already in the atmosphere and lock them away. So if we reduce our emissions on the one hand and we remove the equivalent emissions to the ones we're still causing, then our net impact is zero. So at a high level, that's the journey, one of two halves.
Just give me an example about an organisation that comes to you and says, I want to be more sustainable. Where do you start and where do you take them, and how do you do it?
So that's the question that we're being asked all the time now, and I think it's quite interesting to reflect on our history just for a second there. In 2007, carbon footprints and carbon offset were a bit of a dark art, and so people wanted to have a go at it, to maybe put something on their website to say they were looking at it. We went through the credit crisis. We've gone through the last 5 or 6 years, and now the most common call is from a business saying, we know we need to be sustainable, but we're not quite sure what that means, and we're not quite sure how to get there. The starting point is to understand the value to the business of being sustainable, and by that I mean there are risks associated with continuing to be an unsustainable business, and that might be that your customers no longer want to deal with you, that your investors take a poorer view of the likely performance of your business, that recruitment becomes a challenge as the generation that are growing up with climate change want to work in businesses that are taking sustainability on. So there's a set of risks for any business that's facing sustainability, but there are opportunities as well. And we see all sorts of businesses taking a new view of what they can take to market, whether or not that's a sustainable pension fund, or whether that's a lifetime guarantee on a clothing item that you buy, or whether it's a tyre company that sells distance rather than tyres, so that they have a subscription model that means they'll keep your tyres going whilst you need them. So I think if a management team gets those risks and gets those opportunities and understands the value of taking on sustainability, it all gets a bit easier, really. We have a clear view of why sustainability matters to the business in question. That's where we start.
Well, I wondered if we could reframe it, because a lot of the arguments around going net zero is the cost. We're hearing trillions and billions of pounds, and the sacrifices that companies need to make. But where are the opportunities there for them in an economic business sense?
So I think at a macro level, then there's something like 2 billion people waiting to join the middle class of the global economy. We have these huge growing economies where there is a thirst for a quality of life that hasn't been experienced by the people living there. They want that quality of life, and we know that we can't provide that with a linear economy that produces waste with high emissions services and products. And so the opportunity, I believe, is for businesses to take on that hugely growing market, but to do it in a way that is sustainable. And we can see those kind of propositions coming. I think equally that when we ask consumers in the developed world what they would like, then they want sustainable products, they want sustainable services, and so there is a real opportunity in the market to meet that need.
What are the sort of mitigation processes that organisations put in place to drive towards the goal of net zero?
So when we're talking about action on emissions, then it's useful to think about, in a sense, 3 buckets, and within our field we call those scopes. But really there's the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused directly by the activity that you're undertaking. So for those of us at home, then the 2 things that we most commonly do that directly cause emissions are turn on the gas heating. So that actually burns gas in our home, and so greenhouse gases are caused as part of that combustion to give us hot water and warmth at home, and driving our cars. So then again, we're burning fossil fuels in the engine, and the greenhouse gases are coming out of the exhaust pipe of the vehicle. So the emissions are directly caused there by the activity that we're undertaking. The same applies to business. If a business is using heat in its facilities, if it's running vehicles, then it's causing direct emissions. And those are the things that critically are directly within the control of a business, and so they can go straight after them. With heat, it's about electrification. It's about moving away from burning fossil fuels to create heat and electrifying it, and choosing renewable energy.
Well, lots of examples, and please carry on. There's lots to talk about here, but I just want to know, can you give us an example of an organisation that gets it, that's got it, that's successful in understanding and actioning towards net zero?
Okay, so let me get. I think there's sort of 3 good ones that 2 everyone will be familiar with. So Microsoft have gone fast and hard on net zero. So they are looking at not just removing the emissions that they're currently causing from the atmosphere, but actually have committed to removing emissions, all of the emissions that they've caused right the way back to the 1970s. So they are on a very serious journey to compensate for all of the emissions and remove emissions that are equivalent to all the ones they've caused since they started. And along with that, they're making demands of their suppliers to go after a net zero target. So they're pushing their ambition into their supply chain, which is vital for nearly every business. The largest cause of emissions is not the scope 1 that I was talking about, but is actually the emissions caused by the goods and services that they buy. So that's a really important business. Google, which is a business that we've worked with for many years, have made a commitment to 24/7 fossil fuel free energy, and so that means in any 1 hour period, they will ensure that they procure the same amount of fossil fuel free energy as they're using. So that means locally sourced renewable energy and providing to their facilities. So that's really important, because one of the challenges around renewable energy is, it's linked to nature. When it's sunny, we can produce solar energy. When it's windy, we can produce wind energy. But if neither of those things are on the way, then we tend to go back to using fossil fuels. And so that's a really strong commitment from Google. And then another business we work with, Dentsu International, a large media group, they've set some really ambitious targets for reducing their emissions in line with the science for achieving a net zero business. And so have looked very radically at the way they work, and are really driving towards a new sustainable business model across the whole of their global portfolio.
Ben, you touched on the challenges there. What are some of the obstacles that organisations face in the net zero journey, and how do they overcome those obstacles? That's the important question. I also want to ask you, what does success mean? What does it look like?
Well, so if I take a kind of shocking pessimistic view, we need to reduce our emissions by 80–90%. So that means you come to work on Monday, all the lights are on, all the computers are working as normal, but Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, everything's off. It's that level of change that we need to achieve. It's not a tinkering around the edges. So this is going to require quite hard changes. It's going to require real innovation in business models. It's going to require a level of collaboration in supply chains that we've not yet had. And so I think success looks like thinking very hard about those activities that a business needs to undertake and how. Where is it buying its goods? Who is it procuring services from? What is it that it does within its own operation that uses energy, that uses heat, that uses resources that can be reduced? And I think in the end, we will all be part of businesses that are doing what they do responsibly. I think the end point, however, is that nearly all businesses are genuinely sustainable. What they do is provide long-term value to the whole of society, not just to shareholders, not just to the people who work there, but that what they do to earn a living as a business is itself sustainable. And so I think success looks like an economy full of sustainable services, full of sustainable products, full of things that last a lifetime, full of services that provide a genuine good to people. So I think success looks very different to where we are today. But your question about the obstacles, that level of change is really hard. It's made harder still by it being a long-term change that requires. So 2050 is still more than 30 years away, and that's the date we're all aiming for. There are a few businesses around today who will still have the same management team in place when we get there, and in fact may have changed many times. So there's a real challenge in setting these very long-term goals for businesses and heading out on a journey that we know we won't be here to complete. It's a bit like the cathedral builders, that intergenerational ambition to take on a challenge and pass the baton from one management team to the next. So I think that requires some really different thinking in businesses.
Finally, I have to ask you, Ben, since 2007, you must have seen many false dawns. Do you finally feel that the tide has turned, the penny has dropped, whatever analogy you want to use for it, in the minds of businesses, of course, but also consumers, governments, everybody? Are you filled with a sense of optimism?
So I am, Georgie. I mean, I think, I wouldn't be still running a sustainability business if I didn't think that we could get there. And I think there's a few indicators for me. Our business has doubled in size in the last 12 months, and that is a direct reflection of the quantity of help that's being sought across the economy. So that's a good indicator, number one. Second, I think more often than not now, the people that we deal with in businesses are in the C-suite. If it's not the CEO on the phone asking for help, then it's somebody that reports directly into them. And that's a real change. So back in 2007, it might have been the facilities manager, it might have been the marketing department, it might have been the estates manager, but it definitely wasn't the senior leadership of the business. And so we now find ourselves in the room with these leadership teams that get it. And that's very different. And I think that, in a sense, the final change, and I think the media has moved very significantly in the last few years, is that the debate is no longer, is climate change happening or isn't it? Do we believe it or don't we? Is this something that we should be doing something about or not? That's been answered. And across the globe, it's very rare now to find governments that aren't at least accepting that climate change is there and that we need to do something about it. And in many, many cases are setting really quite stretching targets. So the mood music has changed. The global acceptance that we need to act is there. I think we've got a generation of managers in businesses that know that they've got to act. And as somebody with teenage daughters, we have a generation coming up behind us that don't just know that this is happening, but expect us to get on with it and not leave a catastrophic mess for them. So there's many reasons why I think we should be optimistic, but I think it's going to be hard. But I think we've got a change in this decade. I think there's more and more people see the 2020s as the decade of climate action. Our mission is to make sustainability more than a word, and I think we've talked about this for many, many years, and it's now action. And we're seeing that. We're seeing businesses finally commit the budgets, the people, the organisation in ways that they haven't for the last couple of decades.
Ben Murray, CEO at Avieco, thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgie. Good to meet you.